Today we're going to try to figure out what level of Latin you can read using the ancient Roman poet Lucan's poem Bellum Civile. We're going to listen to Victor recite the poem at 3 different levels. So first, he'll recite the verses of Lucan himself. In these verses, Lucan is describing the fearsome witch Erictho and what her physical appearance was like.
Tenetora profanae, foedasi tu macies, cae loqui ignota sereno, terribilis stugio, facies pallore gravatur, impexi sonerata comis. Si nimbus et atrae, sidera sumducun nubes, tunc Thessala nudis, e greditur bustis, nocturnaque fulmina captat.
So how was that? Victor reads pretty fast, and this is a very advanced piece of writing. It is, after all, ancient Latin in a literary register, so maybe you didn't quite get all of that. If you didn't, we have rewritten Lucan's verses in a simplified prose. This is solidly intermediate level, so let's see if you can understand Victor when he recites the intermediate level.
Volterictonis profanae sordida macies occupat, caelum tranquillum facieius terribilem non novit, quae ob infernum pallorem, et comas incomptas, etiam terribiliores videtur. Si nautem tempestas et imberet atrae nubes caelum ducunt, tunc sagilla Thessala bustis poliatis e greditur, et fulmina nocturna captat.
So what did you think of the intermediate level rewriting of Lucan? Did you think it was easier to understand? It should have been, because we rewrote it in prose, which is almost always easier to understand than poetry. However, if you still didn't feel like you comprehended quite enough about the way that Erictho looked, we have an even simpler version. In this version, we've used vocabulary that mostly appears in Lingua Latina per se illustrata, Familia Romana, or is found in the Dickinson College Core Latin Vocabulary List. So, see what you think about this even simpler retelling.
Erictho foedac tenuis est, ut cadaver, quoniam in sole nunquam volat, facium nino pallida, et capillos turbatos horridos quabet. Itaque, facies eius terribilis, etiam terribilior fit. Dum sol lucet, e tumuli subehabitat, ex ire non solet. Si autem tempestates oriuntur, tunc sagilla Thessala e tumulis exit, ubi nilia remanet, et nocturna fulmina capere temptat.
So what did you think about that simplest level? I think it's pretty readable for anyone that's read through about chapter 20 of Familia Romana. You can see the text up on the screen, and this is a sample page from our new book, Erictho, Tartarorum Terror, which is an all-Latin tiered reader with a Latin glossary and Latin notes. It is tiered selections of verses from Lucan's Bellum Civile about the witch Erictho and how she uses her awesome, terrifying magic to help Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey the Great. We wrote this tiered reader for intermediate students who have learned Latin using more of a reading method that used comprehensible input. What that means is we did not write this for people to translate it. Now you can of course translate it like you can translate any Latin, but we wrote this for students who want more resources that help them read and think in Latin, and that also help them make the jump from reading textbook or Latin written for students to reading authentic Latin, that is, Latin that wasn't written for students, historical literary Latin. And that can be a hard jump. We think we need a lot more resources like this reader to help students make that jump to reading historical Latin. But when we wrote our tiered reader about Erictho, we didn't just have students in mind. We also had instructors in mind and how this book could be used by instructors who want to teach their students Latin in Latin, who want to talk about verse and dactylic hexameter in Latin. To that end, we wrote a bilingual introduction. So part of the introduction, the first part, is in English. And it does answer some really useful questions for you if you're trying to move past just the basic understanding of dactylic hexameter, discussion about caesura, the ictus, and some matters of word order. And it's a resource that I would have really liked to have had when I was teaching AP Latin in the classroom. The Latin part will help you talk about dactylic hexameter in Latin with your students. It's a concise resource. I also did not have anything like this when I was teaching, and I think this information is hard to find in a concise format in Latin. You could go digging through 19th century editions of text and find it, but I think it's really nice to have it at the beginning of the text you're going to teach. Additionally, for students and teachers, students always need that background information about the author and the text they're going to read. So now the teacher, especially the teacher who wants to talk to their students in Latin about Lucan, can read our short bio of Lucan in Latin. In addition to a biography about Lucan, we give you some background information about Erictho in Latin. We also give you some background information about what is true and what is false in Lucan's poem. And one of the main subjects of Book 6, Sextus Pompi, was not actually in Pharsalia. As far as we know from the historical record, he was not there. But Lucan used his poetic license to place Sextus Pompi in Thessalia for the purpose of dramatics. Additionally, if you need a little refresher on how Sextus Pompey's father, Pompey the Great, and Julius Caesar's factions wound up in Thessaly, we've included a few chapters from Eutropius so you can review the start of the Roman Civil War in Latin. So why do we write a tiered reader? Well, it's important to understand we're coming at this from the angle of people need to be reading comprehensible level language in their target language to learn that language. And we wrote this for people who have been able to study and get up to a point where they have intermediate level reading proficiency in Latin. We made a tiered reader because this can provide those people with additional comprehensible input. So beyond just being presented with the verses and being told to read them, you get 2-3 times the input because you have the other tiers and the glossary. Also, we think that it's less daunting for students to be presented with an initial tier or level of Latin that they can comprehend versus just presenting them with the literary register of Latin on adapted Lucan. So this book is written for people who have truly achieved an intermediate level. And that's why Tier 1 is written at the level that it is. It is not written at a basic beginner level because people who are basic beginner 1A level should not be trying to read literary register Latin. One of the important things about a reading and a comprehensible reading style approach is that students gain trust in their ability to comprehend Latin. And they don't lose that trust when they're asked to move on to literary register Latin. I think oftentimes even students who learn grammar translation method have a lot of confidence as they make their way through their textbook, and then they are presented with literary register Latin, and that is like throwing them into the deep end. So if students learn via a reading method that builds up in complexity, and then they use resources like this tiered reader, they will have built trust in their ability to read Latin and larger amounts of Latin. I think that is key. I remember when I was first starting graduate school, and before that when I took Latin in high school and undergraduate, I was always afraid to find out how much Latin I was going to have to read in a given course. I think that students have a very different outcome when they are taught to read large amounts of comprehensible text, and they don't get as intimidated by seeing Latin in front of them on the page, just seeing a bunch of Latin words on the page. And it sounds so strange to say that you're afraid to read in the target language that you're trying to learn, but when you're reading way over your head, way over your level, and you've been trained not really to read, but to look up every third word in the dictionary, it is daunting to read a large amount of text because it takes so much time. We're hoping that if students have learned in a better way than that, and they have the support of this tiered reader, they can really read Lucan and really enjoy it. And again, in addition to thinking about students when we wrote this book and thinking about learners, we also thought about instructors, and it is lower preparation, especially if you want to teach your students in Latin, to already have the simplified tiers there for you. You don't have to go prepare your lessons and hunt for words in the dictionaries and think about how you're really going to rephrase this. You already have a guide there with the glossary and with the lower tiers to help you rephrase Lucan for your students. In addition to that, when I was in high school, and I know this is still done, my Latin 3 class was combined with AP Latin. We were in the same classroom. This book and any tiered reader would be ideal for that situation, and it was not a great learning situation for me as a student. And I know that it was very hard on my teacher. But this book would be great for that because Latin 3 could very easily read tier 1 and 2 of this book, whereas AP could make use of the whole book. And I know that Lucan's not on the AP syllabus right now, but the syllabus is about to be expanded and teachers are going to have a lot more choice. This book will be available this week on Amazon. We're going to use Amazon's expanded distribution services, and we'll also make it available through Ingram Spark. But first, it will be available on Amazon. I've seen teachers say that they can't, because of rules at their school, purchase directly through Amazon. If you want to buy this book, especially as a classroom set, please contact us so that you don't have to order directly from Amazon and we can work something out for you. If you want to get an email the second the book is available, you can follow us on our Substack. And so thank you for listening to our introduction to Erictho and for figuring out what level Latin you could understand. If you want to read more about the book and read another sample page, you can go to our website, lupuslatus.com. We also really like to answer questions about resources and methods for learning Latin. So if you have any of those questions, feel free to email us or make a comment here. We would love to engage with you about learning Latin.